Perfect. Hi, everyone. Today I have the pleasure to have a webinar with Lisa, who just also joined us as an advisor for the advisory board of Dextego. So super happy to have you here, Lisa. I'm sure we're going to have an awesome conversation. So can you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about, I guess, your background and why the topic of the webinar today is so important?
Yeah, so my name is Lisa. I'm really excited to be joining the advisory board and supporting you in this really, really important mission. I am currently a fractional chief people officer, leadership coach, talent strategist, and really my focus is on helping small and growing organizations go from scrappy to sustainable by aligning talent and strategy and equity to create inclusive and strong performance-based cultures. Before that, I worked predominantly in education, first as a history teacher, then as a founding high school principal. And then I transitioned into more systems leadership, first in talent development, then with recruitment, and then with HR as a chief people officer. So I have worked now in a few different industries. And the idea of performance management and feedback is really, really, I think, important to me because this is how people develop and it is what businesses need. You can't keep rehiring, especially now. I think organizations know that very deeply now. And it's what people want. It's what they're looking for in employers. So it's really mission critical, I think, at this point to get this part right.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, your background seems so interesting because you probably had to deal with a ton of different stakeholders, like from education till today to more business, and you're doing your consultancy. So who has been your most favorite person to work with? Like what type of persona?
Yeah, persona, because there's so many people that I've loved to work with. I think people who just want to get it right. I think people who don't have ego, they are hungry for critical feedback and they want to get it right because it's what's right for whoever they're serving, whether it's their clients, whether it's folks who are dealing with addiction, whether it's students, whether it's folks with, intellectual developmental disabilities. It's a wide range of folks. And so I think that's always the person that you can sort of stand shoulder to shoulder with and figure out what's a better way for us to do this and be creative. Those are the folks I love to work with the most.
Yeah, that's funny because, Dextego is dexterity and ego. So a person today was telling me, so is this anything related to like having an ego, like helping people not have an ego? And it kind of is too, because soft skills, for you to learn soft skills, you need to be very, first of all, self-aware and not have the ego to block your development. So when it comes to performance management, and I mean, there are a ton of techniques, so would love for you to tell us a couple for someone who might not be as familiar, but how have you seen also ego play a big role in performance?
Definitely. For me, performance management is just how do we support everybody in our organization to get better in service of both organizational goals and their personal development, that sort of like Venn diagram. And so there's different parts to doing that. One is really identifying what's the goal. Are you judging based on business objective? Do you have a list of competencies that you think is important? Are there specific numerical metrics? I think that's the first piece, is just being clear on what are you working towards. I feel like a lot of ways this goes wrong is people have different goals or are misinterpreting or interpreting the goal differently. I think from there is co-observation, right? And really doing this together. I was looking at some articles before the webinar about performance management, and it used the term monitor, and I don't like that word. It makes it seem like I'm checking up on you, and it's more very top down. And really, like, we've set this goals together. I'm going to be observing you in service of supporting you, giving really critical and clear feedback. And that's, I think, where the ego comes in a lot. And figuring out action plans, right? Because I don't think, while I believe that hiring managers and the importance of hiring managers can't be underestimated, and I'm glad there are all these articles now about that, managers also can't teach everything themselves. And so managers need to also be connectors to say, I know you need to improve on this thing. I'm not your person, but so-and-so is, or actually there's a lunch and learn, you should go. I think being able to be the connector is really important. To your second part about where ego comes in, I think it usually comes in the feedback piece. And for both sides, I think that for managers, sometimes it can come in because ego is just your view of yourself, right? And at the end of the day, so when someone that you're managing isn't performing, you might take that very personally, right? Especially if you were a strong individual contributor who's used to, setting a goal and meeting it. Working with people is really different. So you might be telling yourself stories that you're not competent. You might be frustrated with this person because no one told you what to do. So there's all these stories that a manager can be telling themselves that get in the way of having that conversation. And I think similarly for people who are getting the feedback, we all have different relationships with authority and managers. And I think that sometimes can get in the way. We can take feedback very personally. And I think that's really true in mission-driven organizations where your identity is so wrapped up in who you are, what you do. But I think that to me is why I stress the importance of what are we measuring by and being objective, because most of us care about doing a good job. No one goes to work to be bad at their job. Or very few people. I should say very few people. Yeah. The majority of people want to be good at their jobs. And so being able to be clear, I think, is really important.
Yes, I totally agree. And I think, AI is really allowing us to operate in a safer environment, like a controlled environment where you can practice certain skills so that you don't have that emotion or that ego come out. Like when you're talking to a colleague and there's conflict, and in the moment you get into that fight or fly mode, right? It's another phrase, where you feel like, oh, they're gonna threaten me now. I have to make sure, my boss knows that I did a great job, etc., etc. And it destroys any type of learning. Whereas you do, like with Dextego, a scenario-based challenge online, your AI coach gives you feedback, it's unbiased, you feel protected, then you're actually getting much more prepared for when that thing happens in real life. And I see it all the time. You hire someone that on paper is one type of personality, and then you put them in context and there's someone else. But that's just life. Obviously, we have our triggers, and we can't always perform under stress, but it's very important that you practice, so when that moment happens, you're good and you don't lose yourself.
I think having, I won't say safe, but I think brave space apart from your manager is always important. And that can look lots of different ways. I think AI creates probably a more cost-effective and easier way to do it. I'd also say being in community with other people who do your job. I know that that's how I got good at my job, is either working with principals when I was a principal or working with other chief talent officers to just learn other ways to do things, or having a coach. So I think there's lots of different ways to do it, but I think that space to sort of have scratch paper, like when you used to do math problems and you have a scratch paper, I think that that's really important for folks.
Definitely. Actually, when I became a chief of staff, I joined the community chief of staff network, and I mean, it hit me so much. I was like, what would I have done if I didn't join that group? I would think I'm alone. And we're having these conversations and everyone is dealing with the same issues. Literally, everyone is complaining about the same problems. And immediately you feel like, oh, okay, it's normal.
It's exactly, that's the word. It normalizes it. Like, I remember my first year as being a principal, and some students' reading levels weren't as strong as we thought they were. And it was like, oh my God, what have we done in middle school and blah, blah, blah. I was going down this spiral, and then talked to a friend of mine who was a principal and saying, oh, we've created these reading groups. He's like, oh my God, that's amazing. We need that. And I was like, oh, okay. Everyone is dealing with this.
Yes, yes. So let's talk a little bit about how performance management affects employee satisfaction, that you touched on a little bit. Like I know some employees that love rewards, they love the team bonding, they want to get like a star in their scorecard, and others that couldn't care less about the extra things. They just want to know, will I get my bonus or not? So how do you navigate that different employees have different satisfaction levels and get motivated by different things?
Yeah, I think one is knowing that about each person, knowing who, there are people who throw themselves into their work and it's everything. There are people who love their work, but also need to shut down at 5:30 because they're caregivers and their families. There are folks who need external validation. And then there are folks who they need to internalize the goal for it to matter to them. So I think that's the first piece, is just knowing that, because it doesn't change the content of what you say, but it changes how you might approach it. I think for all of these folks, though, they're going to need to know, what does success look like? And what are ways that I can meet that success? And that I have someone to learn from, whether it's in a community of peers, whether it's I go to a webinar, like different people learn differently, and that's fine. But I think that's what's core and what's similar across all groups.
But for early stage employees, how do you know when they might not know themselves? Like, how can you help young professionals understand what drives them to do an excellent job?
Yeah, I think, some of these conversations also are iterative conversations. I think also, if you would talk to me at 26 versus 29 versus 43, my answer would be super different, right? So I think it's important for you, just because you've had the conversation once doesn't mean you don't keep having the conversation. I think it's important. And we can talk about the importance of stay interviews, but I think everyone generally knows something, right? I might not have a clear, focused 5-year plan, but I might know in 5 years, I want to be working less, or I want to be running my own thing, or I want to be leading something, right? And I think for younger workers and employees, I think they have a general sense of what that is. And one, knowing that might change for people as they, when I started my leadership training program, you saw people who were like, I want to be a school leader. And then they did the program for a year and they're like, I do not want to be a school leader, right? I think you've got to give yourself the grace and give other people the grace that they're going to change their mind. But I think you just start asking and probing questions, knowing that, like you said, it may be really general and it may also change.
Very true. And you mentioned stay interviews. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I am such a fan of stay interviews. We do so much work in talent and with, trying to figure out, why are people leaving? Why are people leaving? And I think that's really important, right? You want to know why people are leaving, but stay interviews are figuring out, why are people staying? Like, it's the version of bright spot analysis when you're doing any sort of like strategic work. Like, where is it working? Why is this person really successful at their job? Or why are these people staying? And I think what that does is it first helps you to understand those individuals better so that you can keep them, right? So like on that very one-on-one foundation, but also as an organization, you start to see trends of what are you working towards, and what are you good at as an organization, and what's the type of person that's going to thrive. You have to do some equity work there and interrogate, like, if it's only one type of person that is successful, right? If it's only people without children that are successful in your organization, or only, folks who have a stay-at-home spouse, like, then you got to do some, interrogation there on that. But I think you start figuring out, oh, we attract people who like to figure things out. That's when I started at high school, one thing I realized, I was hiring great people, but I didn't always hire people that were right for the moment because we were a startup. And I'm sure you're seeing this too, right? Someone who is super successful at Google may not be successful with you because you're in like startup figure it out mode. And I think to the point of stay interviews, the more that you can sort of identify some of the profiles of people that are successful, the better you can craft your employee value proposition, the better that you can attract the people who are. And or, right, think about for the people who aren't successful, how can you what are the things that you can do to create a more inclusive culture so that they can be more successful?
Very interesting. So I heard a lot about also communication and inclusivity in what you said. What are some other soft skills that you think are needed and can impact employee satisfaction so that they stay for the long term? And on the opposite, what are the consequences of them not being there? Like if these soft skills aren't there, what does the workforce look like?
Yeah, I mean, I can't stress the importance of communication enough. I think we oftentimes think that we've said what we mean and we don't. And so it's the difference between actual communication and notification, right? Like I might have told you something, but did you understand it? Did you understand what I meant? So I think communication is I think the core of the majority of problems that I see, both as a principal, as a chief people officer, and as a consultant now. Clarity of language is really important. I think a few others, right? Adaptability, creativity, time management is huge, especially for folks that are new to the workforce, and inherent in that, right? How do you prioritize? And knowing that sometimes you need to get a C+ on something, and that's really hard for some people who are used to getting an A in everything. That sometimes it's like, okay, that thing is going to be okay. I think interpersonal skills, 100%. I think communication covers some of that, but also just listening, active listening is, I think, is really important there. I think those are some of the ones I would say that are core to success at work.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned earlier also feedback, right? Like when performance management is a lot about keeping people accountable and giving them feedback on their progress. How can we basically make sure that through feedback, we do end up developing skills and we don't just provide the feedback and then people bury it?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. So one, I have trouble with the language keeping someone accountable because it makes me feel like I have to control them. Instead, how are they invested in the goal, and how am I developing them in service of that goal? To see if this, and honestly, sometimes a person is not in the right role and not in the right seat, and that I don't think that is a personal, that doesn't mean that they're not good at anything, right? It just might be this moment. So I think for that piece of developing, I think they need to know that feedback is done in service of that development. In Radical Candor, Kim Scott talks a lot about this, the idea of, I tell you the truth because I care about you as a professional, right? It's not, I'm not telling you something so that I feel good about myself, or I'm checking off that I gave the feedback. Like, I really want you to get better. And so I need to tell you the truth about the impact of whatever you're doing. And then making sure that observations are really low inference. There's certain words that I don't even know what they mean. Like, what does it mean to be professional? What does it mean to be a team player? What does it mean to push back? And we know how those words can be weaponized against women and people of color. So I think it's really important to say specifically, you raised your voice, or you got sharp, or you didn't ask a question in that moment and missed an opportunity to build a connection, right? The more specific we can get, I think that depersonalizes it. And really just, how do you stand shoulder to shoulder with that person, instead of saying, John, you are the problem that I need to fix, saying, John, here's this issue. How do we stand shoulder to shoulder to figure this out together? So, because that's what I'm here for.
Yeah, and I think, and I mentioned it before, like sometimes people will feel threatened even if you don't say something threatening, and they have their own traumas, they have their own triggers, and that's totally fine. But we need to try, at least be deliberate in how we communicate, and know that at the end of the day, if it doesn't come across the way you intend to, you're a human too. It's okay, we make mistakes. So it goes both ways, and it's pretty challenging because you, especially as an employee who's trying to go up the ladder, you always feel like you have to be super careful of everything you do. Yeah. And that can actually hinder some other soft skills like creativity that you mentioned. And so there's a balance there. So what are, in your opinion, some strategies, like things people can take away with when it comes to soft skills like empathy, when it comes to communication, like active listening, when you're talking to your boss or to a colleague? How can we help employees on a daily basis to develop these skills?
Yeah, I think it starts with just articulating what excellence looks like. I think that's one part that's important. I think the more that you can normalize feedback, the better. To your point, there's a lot of great stuff and a lot of people much smarter than me who write about trauma-informed workplaces. And I think that's an important conversation to have. People have had traumatic experiences, either in their lives with authority or in workplaces. So I think that's important. But if we're an organization that you're giving feedback to me on something that I did, right? And I'm putting myself in the hot seat, so to speak, as a leader. The goal is to make everyone feel like this isn't personal. This is just about us getting. So I think, I don't know if I'm answering your question exactly, but I think that the more that you can normalize and also give bite-sized feedback too, both positive and both affirming and adaptive feedback, I think is important too. And so the more people just get used to it, I think their nervous systems start to regulate. I remember the first time when I switched schools, getting an observation that was unplanned. And in my old organization, in the DOE, if someone came to your class unplanned, it was because you had done something wrong. And in, my other school, it was, no, we just pop in each other's class and give feedback. That was super helpful for me to remember as I became a principal, is feedback looks different. So the more you can normalize it, I think you bring the temperature down.
And especially today that a lot of people change jobs all the time, right? You have to be adaptable, keep a growth mindset and say, okay, this is a new environment. I have to learn how they operate.
Yeah.
So thanks for sharing that story.
Yeah, I think also knowing as a manager, you don't need to always be the person giving the feedback. If you have a team, if you can create a team culture around shared goals, it allows people to give each other feedback that sometimes feels less charged.
I see. And usually, to your experience, do most companies do like quarterly performance management, or now is it becoming even more frequent, like weekly? What have you seen?
Yeah, so I think the pandemic really shifted how everyone did everything for lots of different reasons. And I feel like people are getting back to realizing they need something, right? A lot of clients are talking to me about either manager training, or we need a performance evaluation system, or we need to figure this out. I think the more frequent the feedback, the better. It's really frustrating to hear something, in December that I did in June. Like, that's not helpful to me. Like, so I think what we're seeing is more of a focus on having regular one-on-ones with folks. And that can be designed lots of different ways, where the focus is on the employee and what they're doing and how they can get better. And a lot of real-time feedback. I see a lot of focus on that. In addition to having dedicated times where you step back. And that's really what an annual or a biannual review should be. It's to say, let's step back and see all of the things that we've talked about. What's the trend? Both good and bad. What are the trends? That should be really what the evaluation is, not, this isn't a time for you to hopefully learn new information.
And what have you seen in terms of the high performers? Like, what have you seen some common qualities amongst them be?
Yeah. I guess it depends on how we define high performers, but in general, high performers are folks who can figure things out on their own. They're very resourceful, right? I don't expect my boss to be everything to me. I'll, go on a webinar. I'll look at this. I'll talk to this other person. They get it done no matter what, which can also lead to burnout. So that's something to just be thoughtful about. I think high performers tend to be highly adaptive and creative, right? Because they don't see a roadblock is a wall. They see it as just a hurdle to figure out.
Right.
So there is a growth mindset in that space. I would say that high performing individual contributors, though, are sometimes the people who struggle with managing others the most, because they are used to performing at such a high level. One, they don't fully understand why some folks might struggle. And their managers never had to really manage them. So they haven't seen effective management because they didn't need it.
And they don't have the patience to basically deal with others. Yeah.
It's either patience, a lack of empathy. And I don't mean these things in like, you're a bad person. It's like, this is just what it is. And you have to figure that out. I used to joke, I don't think this is untrue, that if you were really good at a subject, you probably shouldn't teach it. Because you actually, like, I found the people who struggled, like, obviously there's exceptions to any rule, but some of the best teachers are people who didn't necessarily love a subject from the beginning. Or obviously they may have learned it, but if you're naturally good at something, it makes it harder to be a teacher, I think.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I've never thought about it like that, but it so makes sense. And I used to do research, with a professor during my grad school about stars, and this entire like curse of being a star is what you're saying, that you pile up everything because people just give them every task to you. They're like, oh, we'll do it, okay, you, and you won't say no because you do want to do more and you're fast, and that can really cause burnout. But the problem is you have to know that for yourself, because your manager will most likely not, because they want you to perform, is obviously that benefits them, and they can predict when you'll say one day, okay, I quit. So it can turn into a very big challenge, I think, for leaders if they don't know how to deal with a star. And like performance management when it comes to stars is somewhat different than others, because it's a choice. Like, do I want to just have them become a manager and further along the ladder, or do I them more isolated because that's where they perform best on their like own timing?
Yeah, I think you just hit on something that I think is really important, is growth for people looks different. For some people, they want to grow into leadership. For some people, they really just want to be an amazing subject matter expert, and be a really strong individual contributor who has a seat at the table because of what they know, but they don't want to manage people. And so I think knowing that growth can look different and knowing what matters to people. I think Kim Scott talks about this, like rock stars versus shooting stars. And shooting stars are those people who wanted to be promoted yesterday, and they're willing to take on the risk, and they, are totally fine with figuring stuff out on their own. And then there's some people who really struggle in that type of environment, right? And again, there's no good or bad, it just is. And your rock stars are people who want to kind of take a slower route, and have a longer runway to figuring out whether it's leadership or something else. So also knowing people and how they work under pressure, in addition to what makes them, how they define growth, I think is important.
I watched the video of Obama the other day that he was giving advice to the young generation about how to succeed. And he said, when you go in an organization, rather than thinking of like being promoted, just do everything they ask you and do it well. At the moment you start completing tasks without asking your boss of, more advice or whatever, then they will notice you. But again, I think the caveat there is that others notice that too. So how does that impact the dynamic of the entire team, or the majority of the employees that go into one path, and then you have others that either suddenly appear into the leadership, or they're, to your point, the ones that decide they want to be shooting stars. How does that affect the dynamic? How can someone like you in your role, chief learning officer, chief people officer, how can they create a team that's bonded and does not compete with each other when everyone has their different paths?
So one thing I would say, one thing I learned the hard way, and a coach helped me with this, is you want a portfolio of people in a team. for cohesion, right? I think it's important to have a few of different types of folks, because they make each other better and they can focus on that. I don't think I think you can have a team of rock stars and they generally will get along and be collegial and have some cohesion. They may not, for those folks who kind of take a steady path, they may not have the urgency of a shooting star, which can sort of sometimes add some adrenaline to a group too. So I would say having a diverse group is really important, because I think then you have a team that can push each other, and you as a leader don't have to be as top down. Like, it's more that you are being a conductor than a drill sergeant.
I like that. Yes. Do you have any favorite like exercises that you've done for team bonding?
Yeah, so I have to be honest that when I first started out, I thought team bonding was like not necessary. It was just a waste of time, was something that people did that was silly and detracting. And over time, really quickly as a leader, you learn when you're on the other side of things, you're like, oh, people need to know how to work together. So, and different people have different reactions to icebreakers and, you know, those sorts of things. So I always loved activities that were loosely connected to the work, but not about the work. So that could be, you know, whether someone does Myers-Briggs, or we did these, I think it's I always forget which one it is. It's like a red, yellow, blue. And we identified each other in terms of our thinking styles. And then each group reported out on a few questions, right? Like, why do I think this way? How do I take care of people? How do I operate under stress? Activities that are around getting to know each other so that you know how to work together, I think are always really important. And, you know, obviously you need to be thoughtful about this in terms of people's ability. But I always loved, and maybe this is also from an education standpoint, doing some sort of fitness class. Because for us, to your point before, right, how do you get high performers to be better managers when they may not have empathy? Putting them in a completely different situation where they may not be successful really builds empathy really quickly. And they, you know, and there's different types of instructors, and then unpacking with the team what kind of feedback was motivating, what was demotivating, why, how do we use this to sort of, you know, get better for ourselves. I think if you're running a leadership training program of any sort, I think those activities, anytime you can be in an activity where people are doing something, and it could be pottery, it could be painting, right? It doesn't have to be an active thing, but getting people out of their comfort zones to see what it feels like when they're not immediately successful, I think is important. And I think there's always, you know, there's always room for breaking bread together and having a meal and having drinks together, being thoughtful though that alcohol isn't the central piece, right? So I think bonding looks lots of different ways. I also think having people talk about the work is bonding, right? Not everyone comes to work wanting to make friends. Some people do, that's great. But if like we're working on an initiative together, how can you as a leader bring people together to talk about the work and analyze it and push on each other in different ways too? So I think all of these things have to be in play, right? The totally personal, the more bonding that helps us to communicate and work together as a team. And then building community around the work. I think those are the three pieces that have to be a part of your strategy.
Yeah, that's a very interesting approach, what you mentioned. Like an example of an activity I've done that always works, like no matter who is part of it, is one based on compliments. So I've done that at work with friends. It always works, I'm telling you. So you get a piece of paper out and you basically have everyone write a compliment for you and vice versa. You go around and write for others. The smiles I see every time is just amazing. Like really just boosting people a little bit through something very simple as, you know, I like how you always start a call asking us, how are you? Or like, you have a great smile. Simple things open them up so much more into having a conversation and doing other activities together than just starting, okay, today we're gonna do icebreakers, here you go. And then having these reactions of, oh, okay, this is awkward or whatever. And the other thing is games that has worked for me a lot, like doing virtual event, escape rooms, like any sort of game really gets them in a more comfortable like environment, especially if this is a new team. I think if it's a team that knows each other, definitely also the drink around the table or like food and stuff can help. But when you have something to say, so when it's a new team, I think engaging in activities, definitely helping them unleash and be like more comfortable with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I love all of those. And the compliment one, right? I think you're describing it as to why it's important for the person receiving compliments. But for the people giving it, it's helpful to remember this is what this person is good at, right? Sometimes we focus so much on what isn't happening that we forget how much good is happening.
Yes.
But I feel like that would be an activity that benefits everybody.
Yes. And on another note, it can also be a bonding activity, but company updates, like bringing the entire team together to see all their successes for the last like quarter or months, I think is super bonding as well.
Yeah,
Like,
definitely.
oh, we did it. Like, that's us.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
So tell me a little bit about what is hot now in the talent development space, performance management. Like, is there anything new coming up? Maybe like a new framework, something that you're interested in? Is there anything like that?
I don't know if it's just like I'm an old soul, but I feel like the basics are so hard to get right that there's lots of ways to do it, right? I think the newness is in how do we capture this? Is there a new platform that can capture this? And I think there's a lot of what I'm seeing is more HR tech that's geared towards like, how do we to your point, how do we recognize each other in a more systemic way, as opposed to just waiting for people to say thank you? Because I think the basics are the basics. What I would say also, actually, let me correct myself. I think interrogating how we talk about work through an equity and inclusion lens, I think is important. And it goes back to what I was saying before, like, what does it mean to be a team player? What does it mean to push back? I think, I hope to see more of it. I don't know if there's enough people doing that work, but thinking through how do you unpack that language in a way that's actually helpful and mitigates bias in giving that. So I think that's one push that I see. And then the second is, again, how do you just operationalize this so it's not just a bunch of emails in a Google sheet and floating in the ether, that there's a way to actually gather people analytics, right? Because I think as an organization, it's interesting, what are people thanking each other for, right? Because that's a value. That's helpful for me to know if everyone's thanking each other for collaborating, then that tells me that we hired well, but it means that collaboration is really a value. And so now I want to make sure people feel like they have the space to collaborate. So I think there's a rise in people analytics for that too.
Yeah, and I think the value should really be driven by the employees. Like when the company starts, though now this is harder if the company is already big and is known for some certain values. But what I did with my team is, for instance, that like ask them, what do you want our values to be? Not just one person saying, okay, that's what this company is about, and now everyone has to identify with these values, right? It just creates a gap.
I think you want employees to be a part of creating, but I also, like, for example, like if I was to start an organization tomorrow, and I think you would probably be similar, right? Like there is a value of equity, right? There is a value that we want to be inclusive, right? If someone came to you and said, I don't think inclusion is a value, I don't think you would be like, okay, cool. So I think naming some things on the front end for folks that this is going to be a priority. And if that's not, or you might, especially in a startup value, like we do need to be figure it out people right now. I do think it's okay for leaders to name things in startup, but how you get there, what that looks like. I think you want to invest people in it, but there is part of hiring that I think it's okay for a leader to say, here are some values. And if you're down for it, that's great. And I had to do that as a startup leader with a school, because there are some people who didn't want to figure it out as they went along. And that's great. They were amazing teachers that were successful in other places, but they wouldn't have been successful in our type of environment. But I think you always want to invest folks in, like, what does this look like? How do we celebrate it? What are other ways we can, create space for this thing? I think you always want to have employee investment engagement.
Yeah. And how do you think someone should react when there is negative feedback on the company, and then they go like online and they write terrible things, like don't get a job there and stuff? Like, how can a company recover from this?
Well, is the question more on how the organization responds to negative feedback, or how should someone respond to negative?
I think the company, because there is a level of, okay, that feedback can actually be very true. So either the company accepts or not, but what if the feedback is false? Like, what if just an employee got pissed, they couldn't get a bonus, and they went and said negative things,
Yeah, I mean, if someone was to go on our on a Glassdoor review and say a lot of negative things, I think, you don't win by kind of trying to argue. That's definitely not going to be the case. I think demonstrating that, this was your experience, we are sorry, and we are going to learn from it. And if it is something that's happened, it doesn't even have to happen most of the time, right? It might just happen 20% of the time. But articulating how you're getting better at that thing, right? So if, like, work-life balance, this is the first thing that came to mind. There's no work-life balance. Like, we're making steps to make this work really sustainable. We're not where we want to be. We thank you for your feedback and your time with us, right? Like, that kind of tone would be the comment if you want to comment on anything. If it's one comment in a sea of a lot of positive ones, you've got to weigh the pros and cons of that. But if you're going to comment, I think you've got to acknowledge that this was this person's experience, and that you're learning something from it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess my last question would be, what is a big, like, lesson you've learned in your life, in your career, that you think everyone should know? And if you have a favorite quote. I like quotes.
Oh my goodness. There's so many things in quotes. I think that one thing that I would let folks know is that what I've learned over time is that the higher up you get in an organization, I think that's where the soft skills and the interpersonal skills matter the most. It gets actually more imperative because you're working with peers, right? Who may not, some people are just not people that listen to anyone but the boss. And some people just have a million things to do, right? They're not going to prioritize your thing. So communication, finding win-win situations, like really working on those things, I think is really important. I'd also push people. I was just talking to a high school friend about this. I think you want to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And what I mean by that is continue to put yourself out of your comfort zone. And that doesn't mean at work all the time, right? Like, it doesn't have to be, but doing improv, like doing something crazy that you haven't done before, trying a new sport, like consistently putting yourself in a learner position, I think is really important, because then when you find yourself in uncharted territory, you don't freak out. You don't think, oh my God, I don't have the roadmap. You're like, okay, I've figured things out before. I've done hard things before. And it builds your sense of self-efficacy.
That is something I couldn't agree with more. Like I always say, if you try to build self-confidence, you just got to prove yourself that you got this, you're achieving your goals. And you can only do that by either putting these goals or just by ending up in an environment that it's unknown and you push yourself. And I wish more people did that. And it's hard because, we all get so busy and we always find excuses, but you got to engineer this in your daily life. There's no other way.
Totally. I don't know if this is the quote, but it's one I say to folks a lot, is like, the best way to get started is to just to get started. And from there, you can assess what's working, what's not working, and shift accordingly. But I think sometimes folks wait until they have the perfect action plan or the perfect conditions. You have to, everyone starts somewhere.
Yes, I love that. So we encourage everyone to start something they had in mind today and start their skills to become better. And yeah, hopefully we can aspire for a world where soft skills is a must and everyone goes and works on themselves first to acquire them.
Definitely.
Thank you so much for your time, Lisa. This was wonderful. You gave us so many insights. I appreciate your time. And where can people find you?
Yes, I think the best way to find me is on LinkedIn. I am on all of the social medias, but my work self is on LinkedIn. So just at Lisa Friscia.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you again. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Okay.